Tell me about your profession.
Well, I got out of there. The first thing I did was I had a terrible knee operation my senior year at Clemson, and right before the South Carolina game, which was a big game for us. That's the one I really wanted to play in, and I was outside linebacker and ready to play and doing well. I already had the knee operation the year before and thought I was over that. Got hurt again, and that was real disappointing for me. But after that was over with, we got out and it's time to go to work. I couldn't walk. I couldn't get around, and so I had to kind of stay out. And I took a job, went down and interviewed for a job with Standard Oil, and it so happened that I couldn't pass the physical test that they gave me. So they said, this isn't all. I said, I'll tell you what, said, why don't you just come back in about 6 months? You're either going to be better then, or you won't be any worse. Mm-hmm. But said, we can't take you the way you are now with this knee operation. So I went back 6 months later, and I went to work for Standard Oil, and I worked for them about 3 years, something like that. And then Ed Turner from Charles, he had his business in Cincinnati, Ted Turner's father. And he decided they had a situation where that you couldn't sell the billboards, produce the billboard paper, and also own any company or any stock in the billboard business. And they had a national company at that time handling sales for them, like your national accounts. Mm-hmm. That's how Ted Turner's dad got started, was in the billboard business. Okay. And I came to Knoxville with that setup, with the billboard company to run that. That's before, just before Ted got into the cable business with CNN. But as it happened, I left Standard Oil and went with Ted Turner and his father, Ed, in Charleston. He had an office in Savannah, and he would come up once a week, and we would talk and do this as father. Then I worked there in the Charleston area with Ted and his father being in Savannah. Then Ed Turner took his life. I don't know whether you knew that, Ted's father. I didn't know that. He took his life. He had gone out and tried to replace all those offices that we had nationally for the sales arm of the billboard company, because it was called Southern Outdoor Markets. And he had to work for the national company. Ed was a real smart man. I'm sure that's where Ted got his brilliance from. But Ed went in the Navy in 1942 during World War II as a seaman and came out as a full commander. Wow. So he really wanted and thought he could do that, and he needed the support. He was going to form a new association that would sponsor and put up money to have a national, southern at least, representative in the New York and Chicago and Los Angeles offices. So they sent me to New York, and I went up there to work there on Madison Avenue, and got that experience. And I wanted to come back. I didn't want to leave Atlanta to start with. By this time, I moved out of Charleston, was already into Atlanta. And so, I don't know, it worked out whether it was real funny the way it worked out, that I finally got my chance to get out of New York if I'd take the Knoxville job as managing the billboard company, which his father had as a part of that, the reason that he took on too much responsibility. Mm-hmm. But he left Ted with about a $2.5 million cash flow business, and Ted took over and brought his roommate, a guy by the name of Peter Dames, brought him with him, and got him, put him to work. And the next thing you know, I'm at this time now, I'm in Knoxville just doing great, and they called me up. They sold the company. Ted sold the company. He wanted to get into the television business, really. He tried to sell out of the billboard. So he said, well, I'm doing you a favor. You always wanted to get out of New York and get back to Atlanta. He said, aren't you happy? And I said, well, that's before I moved to East Tennessee. So it happened that I was down there and got transferred back down there, and I had to leave Knoxville, and I wanted to come back. So after that, he had convinced me that I was in the right profession of being in the marketing business and being in solving problems, particularly in the billboard and cable. And cable had more problems in the beginning than any company I'd ever worked for. You know the reputation of the cable guy who says he's going to show up today, you don't see him, for a week,
Yeah.
back. That's the way it
Right.
was. So I ended up really going back down to Atlanta, working for Ted in the billboard business, and finally I had an opportunity to come back to East Tennessee by coming back to work for Charles Tumber's advertising agency, who happened to be the president and CEO of the Lost Sea, a tourist attraction over here in Madisonville and Lenore City. And I came back, they asked me if I'd come back and handle the marketing on that. Said there was a cave in there, and they were going to develop it and call it the Lost Sea.
Mhm.
And that was my job, was to promote that.
Really?
But it gave me an opportunity to come back to East Tennessee. And when I came back to East Tennessee, I worked there. They also bought a town called Gold City over in North Carolina,
Mhm.
a western town up on a mountaintop with a chairlift going up over in Franklin. So he said, but you love cowboys and you like all that stuff and you look the part. Why don't you go over there and manage that for us? So I went over and managed that in the summer of 1970 and loved it. Just had a great time. Took the family with us.
Mhm.
Franklin, North Carolina is right in the middle of western North Carolina. Just beautiful there. And whenever we decided to come back after the summer was over, I said, man, I'd really like to do this. Well, in the meantime, the building burned, and we had to wait a couple of years before we rebuilt and got back in it. So I just stayed here in the Knoxville area and took care of the Lost Sea.
All right, we're going to go into the MarshallAndy questions now.
Mhm.
Tell us how you got the name MarshallAndy.
Well, I'll tell you how it happened. I was, while I was at Gold City and came back after the summer, they hired me to go out to the fair and MC a show for the Rangers coming off the rappelling tower out there, TVA Night Fair here in Knoxville. And I don't know, it's just, I had a money pole out there, where the kids could climb the pole for $10, and I MC'd that. Then I had a band. I brought my band from North Carolina that we had in the saloon band that we had. We'd have like 8 gunfights a day and 8 saloon shows. And I brought them over here, and they liked it. They kept me on during the whole fair season. Matter of fact, I did 13 years off and on there. But we got to talking. There's a guy named Al Curtis. He was the president of PBS at that time. He's since died. But he had a big band, like a 30-piece orchestra, and they would play down at the Hyatt and places like that. So I was a big band singer. I didn't mention all of that during my times. I always found a place to get a band and sing, no matter where I lived. I always had a place to sing in a nice supper club type atmosphere, not honky tonks, but real nice places with big band music. World War II basically music. Frank Sinatra, Perry Como type music. And I thought, well, I'd bring that band over here, and I did. So I went to Al Curtis, who was running the information booth. He was also, now remember, he volunteered. He was, as I told you, he was at the PBS as a president, but he volunteered his time. Well, let's just say you had a kid at the fair and he got lost, and the announcer would say, come pick your kid up at the place. He gave out the schedule for everything. So during the break of my shows, I did a 2 o'clock show and a 3 o'clock show and a 4 and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
He would introduce me coming on, and he was calling me Uncle Andy and Cousin Andy and whatever he'd come up with. So I would go over there and just, as something to do during the shows, and talk and just hang around with him. So I went over there after my hands were bleeding. And he said one day after a show, my hands were just hitting gravel. I played the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to be the good guy. I loved that. I played that bad guy in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
So I went over and talked to him, and he said, your hands are bleeding. He said, why in the world? What's that doing? I told him about me falling in the gravel rocks and all, and I'd already done 3 shows that day, see? And he said, why would you want to do something like that? I said, I just love playing the bad guy. And he said, I think, and I was 41 years old by this time. He said, I think you ought to, who writes the shows? And I said, I do. He said, why don't you write yourself in as a good guy, as the sheriff or something? I said, well, I just hadn't thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, we got a good sheriff. Anyway, I got ready, and he started to announce. He said, by the way, what is your name? I've been calling you Uncle Andy and all these things. I said, well, I don't really have Andy Smalls is my real name. Andrew J. Smalls, as you've already mentioned here. I said, well, that's what I'll do, is just be Andy Smalls. He said, no. He said, you need a professional entertainer name. And he said, well, what about if I just say, go over there at 3 o'clock and see Sheriff. How about Sheriff Andy? And I said, no, there's another guy using that name, Sheriff Andy, that's doing pretty good right now. I think I'll leave that alone. He said, well, how about MarshallAndy? I said, sounds good to me. So he said, ladies and gentlemen, at 2 o'clock, go over and see MarshallAndy with the money pole and the Rangers on the tower, and that kind of thing.
So that's how I got there.
Mm-hmm. A long way to answer your question, but
it's okay. Now, you told me this off camera, but there's a spelling of MarshallAndy. The word
Yeah.
Marshall. Tell us about that story.
well, I had a picture of Roy Rogers when I was about 16 years old, and he had come to my hometown, and there's a picture of Trigger rearing up in front of the theater, which wasn't our theater, but it was one he was passing out there. He'd been in Ohio, some other place. He's from Ohio, as a matter of fact. But I had that picture, and here I am, 40, 42, 3 years old, and as many times as we moved, we bought 13 houses in my lifetime.
Wow.
I thought, well, it's hard to hold on to that, but somehow or other I held on to Roy Rogers' picture, a photograph, 8 by 10. As they used to say, 8 by 10 glossy. Anyway, I had that picture. So Ross Bagwell, who was handling the Roy Rogers roast beef account for Roy, when he had that, do you remember Roy Rogers roast beef?
No, no.
Well, it was kind of like Arby's or something in that nature. As a matter of fact, probably copied it some. But anyway, Ross Bagwell from Knoxville, who owned a big television show at the time, and he started what is now, right now, the Better Homes and Garden, the thing that they've got up now with the real estate, but out there off the interstate. But he was in charge of those commercials. So he got Roy to come down here to do some commercials.
Okay.
And I thought, gosh, if I could just get to interview him for mine. By the way, I had already had my show over with Al Curtis by this time. And I thought, well, if I could, at PBS, I thought if I could just get Roy Rogers. So I got him in there I didn't have anything to do with it, but through Ross Bagwell. And I showed him that picture, and I said, would you sign that for me? And he said, yeah. And he started to write down. He said, Marshall. And I said, is Marshall your real name, or is it a TV name? I said, no, it's just a TV name. He said, well, then I'll spell it with one L. And I never had heard of that before. So he said Marshall, because if you use your name as Marshall, if it's your first name or your last name, it's Marshall. Well, that's where I'd always spelled it. So, but he spelled it with one L. It's on this badge, you see, it says U.S. Marshal. But if I found out, and I said, what, is that the way you spell Marshal? He said, yeah. He said, look, if it's a position, you have a title, like a lawman, a marshal, or a fire marshal, or a parade marshal. And I don't know how many parade marshals. He says it has one L. And I said, well, whatever you say. He said, but don't feel bad. He said, not anybody. He said, I didn't know that. I did 8 shows as a marshal before I realized that it had one L.
So you've hosted a show on TV titled The Riders of the Silver Screen.
Yeah,
That's been going on for, what, 29, 30 years now?
Right now, this is my 40th year.
40th. Okay. So how did that come about?
Well, as you know, my whole boyhood is, I think through this interview, we've established the fact that I dress the part of the cowboy when I'm doing the show and all, but I really love it. At one time, from about 1930, talkies had just been in. The silence, people that didn't have the talent to talk and act was moving out, and talkies came in. So all of your TV stars, movie stars at that time came in, and the ones that could make us the cowboy star, like, people in those early days, in 1930, you had Buck Jones, Ken Maynard, and Hoot Gibson, and those people already established. But they brought in a bunch of new ones since talkies started to come in. And you got in new people like, Gene Autry came in, then Roy Rogers, and Lash LaRue, and Sunset Carson, and Whip Wilson, and Johnny McBrown, the All-American from Alabama, football player. All those people started coming in, and it lasted from about 1930 1930 until 1953, and some people say 54. There might have been one more made in 54. I was born in 29, so this hit me just right coming up. At one time, from 1930 to 1954, every movie theater, whether it was in a small community or a big theater downtown like the Tennessee is in Knoxville, or the Lyric is here in Loudon, no matter what the size was, every Saturday morning, every kid in America was doing the same thing. I don't know when that ever happened before or since. They were filling up that theater and staying all day in the movies. Great babysitter, you know, you could go back down there to the babysitter.